Ms. Davis. We will now hear from Ms. Adinig. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman Clyburn and members of the Select Subcommittee on Coronavirus Crisis. I'm grateful for the honor and privilege it is to be here. My name is Cynthia Adinig, and I never expected to be here disabled and speaking on behalf of a growing number of community of millions from across the nation. Before I got sick in the first wave, I was a multitasking supermom and entrepreneur. I ran 2 businesses, volunteered at my church, and multiple charities while homeschooling my young son. Unfortunately, I can no longer serve or work in the capacity that I used to, because from time to time now, my body becomes overwhelmed with nausea, dizziness, intermittent paralysis, crippling joint pain, an unexpectedly high heart rate, to the point I fear I'm having a heart attack or stroke. I also currently have a 7-year-old genius son who suffers from long COVID. The summer of 2020 was many, many trips in the hospital, and I was dying. I lay awake night after night thinking mournfully about the very real potential my son would grow up without a mother. As my struggle to recover continued, I was unexpectedly thrust into advocacy stemming from a blatant racially biased incident in September 2020. While being a wheelchair-dependent person at the time, I was threatened with arrest by emergency room hospital staff while seeking medical help through an episode of dangerously low oxygen and high heart rate. This same hospital had tested me for illicit drug use without my knowledge 3 times prior in response to the long COVID symptoms I presented with. In spite of my negative drug tests repeatedly coming back negative for illicit drug use, I was even slated to be given Narcan for withdrawal during one of my admissions for long COVID. Yet without apology, this hospital now touts itself as a post-COVID rehabilitation center. I'm standing here today thanks to a heavy regimen of medications, but I still remain disabled, chronically ill, and undertreated. Unfortunately, my last trip to the emergency room from long COVID just 2 weeks ago remains startlingly reminiscent of my care 2 years ago, as it produced little more than this bruise from my IV of fluids. Though I went to the hospital with symptoms common for myself and others stemming from long COVID, I wasn't administered any medication, nor was the protocol for my diagnosed symptoms followed. As I stiffly hobbled out the hospital at the crack of dawn, I caught an Uber home, mulling over the harsh reality that efforts and advocacy thus far has resulted in little visible progress in education of medical staff concerning long COVID. I'm currently tasked with monitoring my son's vitals daily, with little hope of getting him care for his intermittent struggle of an elevated heart rate, blurry vision, and fatigue, as there are very few experienced post-viral pediatric specialists in the nation. I know my mention of race in regards to long COVID care will make some of those watching this hearing defensive. However, it is clear through unbiased studies and historical records that race and gender play a major part in hurdles in American healthcare. Some who listen may even rebut that my mention of racism is a means to divide and provoke. A select few may even say I should simply be happy with the current level of long COVID healthcare in America, that my privilege of standing here before you should be enough. But to quote Martin Luther King Jr., I criticize America because I love her. I can proudly say that I know we as Americans, including yourselves as members of Congress, can come together in addressing long COVID, as I owe much of my recovery to many in the MECFS community, former complete strangers such as Ashanti Daniels, Wilhelmina Jenkins, and Rivka Solomon, who heard my story and leapt to act. Long COVID is projected to directly affect over 20 million within our nation, and the strain it puts on our economy and working families is far greater. I'm asking that our members of Congress come together and pass the Care for Long COVID Act to create an official COVID-19 Victims and Survivors Memorial. And I ask you to please commit to making a federal standardized disparity index system for medical centers. I don't ask you to do this for me and the future of my precocious bright son, but also in remembrance of over 1 million lives lost to COVID and for every American family that has been impacted by this pandemic. Thank you.
Well, thank you very, very much. We've now heard from all of our witnesses, and each member will now have 5 minutes for questions. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Ms. Adinig, we've just heard from your opening statement that you have suffered from severe and often debilitating long COVID symptoms over the past 2 years. Adding insult to injury, you have shared with us in your statement how medical professionals have not taken your symptoms seriously. Now, not many of us have had that experience of not being taken seriously or being disbelieved. Could you share a little more as to what that experience is like?
Absolutely. It's been a traumatic experience. I came into the healthcare system thinking that I was going to a safe space, a space where I would receive help. But week after week, as I starved, as long COVID has caused me to develop a severe allergic reaction to all food and water, I starved for weeks to the point that I ended up in a wheelchair. I knew I was dying. I begged for help from several hospitals, and no one listened. And I was terrified that I would not see my son's 5th birthday. And in spite of that, I still have to go back to those same spaces for care and hope that maybe this time they'll listen. But sadly, in spite of my diagnosis of long COVID, MCAS, POTS, dysautonomia, multiple chemical sensitivity. Now,
You know this, but I just want to reiterate that you're not the only one suffering from long COVID to have experienced this doubtful questioning. To illustrate that point, I ask for unanimous consent to enter into the record a statement that this committee has received from Senator Tim Kaine, who has been suffering from long COVID since March 2020. Without objections. Senator Kaine writes, quote, "For the last 2 years, I have experienced near constant nerve tingling, which feels like every nerve ending in my body has had 5 cups of coffee." After Senator Kaine began to share his long COVID experience publicly, he heard stories from many others suffering from the condition and struggling to be taken seriously. He further writes, and I quote, "Many who shared their long COVID stories with me felt that they were not being believed by the medical community or that their symptoms were being misdiagnosed and mischaracterized as anxiety or depression." End of his quote. Ms. Davis, I understand that you have also been affected by long COVID and have worked with many other long COVID patients